Hi, I'm Anne. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the classic books that I will probably never read. The only reason I'm including probably is because there's probably like 90% chance that I won't read these books, but I do want to include that 10% just in case I decide to do like a reading challenge where I read books that I refuse to read. So you gotta put that little bit of caveat in there just in case in like a year or two I read one of these books and you guys are like, wait, you said you'd never read this book. And just because I refuse to read these books does not mean that I don't see merit in reading them, so I would never judge someone for like, oh yeah, that's one of my favorite books. This is just my preferences in reading. I know that these books would not be ones that I will enjoy. The first one is Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. This book is from the 1950s and it explores a man's obsession with a young girl. Now, I do see a lot of merit in reading this book. However, it's not a book I would ever read. I did enjoy Very Literary Carrie and Lady Jane Books did a great live stream on this. They buddy read it together. I really enjoyed hearing their commentary of how impactful this book was to society. And I think it is important to understand people who have this unhealthy obsession and understand psychologically how a person can get into this situation and understanding how unhealthy it is. And so I'm not saying there's not merit in reading it, but I never want to read this book. Number 2 is Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. I read a previous book by Thomas Hardy, Far from the Maddening Crowd, and I enjoyed it. However, this one I will never be reading. I watched the movie, and so I know the general plot line, and let me just say, it is pretty horrific. It's about this young woman who's very idealistic. She falls in love with this young man, and basically she is used by these two men, and her innocence is taken away. In a sense, it explores how society fails young women in the Victorian era, because this came out in the 1890s. And while it is interesting and an important topic to consider, it's just not one that I would ever want to consider. I've seen the movie. It's pretty horrific. It ends with a really sad ending, and I just don't see that much enjoyment I have in reading that type of book. I think it's an important story to understand and know how harsh it was on women in the Victorian era. I guess it was very harsh on men too, so it was both, but so I do appreciate how important this story is, but it is unpleasant and I will never want to read it. The next one is Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews. This book came up a lot in my researching for finding books to read for Garb August next month, which is a readathon where you're supposed to read trashy books. And this one came up often and I had no idea it was trash, but I did watch an adaptation that came out maybe about 10 or so years ago. I also know the general story. My mother read it, and I just know this is not a book I will ever want to read. It was released in the late 70s, and it explores themes of incest as these 4 children are locked away in an attic by their grandmother, who is very abusive, and the 2 oldest children end up falling in love. While I see it is important to understand what psychologically kids go through when they are in this type of situation and how harsh it can be, it's just not a book I would ever want to read. And it sounds pretty traumatic and horrible. And the whole incest thing, I just don't see any value in myself reading it. The next one I will never read is Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. French name, forgive me. This is a book, I believe, that explores a woman's semi-abusive, very neglectful relationship with her husband, and because of that, she turns to having affairs with several different men. That's basically the entire story, and no, it does not look interesting to read. It came out in the 1850s, so it's quite early on, and it was a very taboo book at the time because it explored women's sexuality, which was a rather taboo topic at the time. I just don't want to read this type of book that explores women cheating on their husbands and becoming horrible. I understand that Anna Karenina is greatly loved, and I read Anna Karenina and I have deep regrets because I really did not like that book either. So this book sounds very similar to Anna Karenina in many ways, and I'm just not interested in ever reading it. And in the same vein, I suppose, is Lady Shatterly's Lover by P.H. Lawrence. This was a book that came out in the 1920s, and it was so controversial when it first came out, similar to Lady Bovary practically a century before. This book explores a young woman's affair with her husband's gardener. Oddly enough, this book was banned as being pornographical, which I feel like nowadays, considering all the erotic romance that's out there, this would not be considered that bad. But back then, it was so risque and so horrible, and I just don't see any value in reading this book. What is it about a woman's affair with this other man? That's the entire book. There's no value. There's no like message of like, oh, don't do this, or this is what will happen if you let your heart overcome your mind, or your lusts overcome your better sense. It's none of that. I don't see any value in reading this book, and thus I have no interest in reading this book. The next book is Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. This is a book, I also saw the movie adaptation that came out maybe a decade or two ago, and I really disliked that movie. Basically, it's about this young man who is in university. He meets another young man and befriends him, and he gets drawn into the world of his friend. And his friend is from a very, very wealthy family. He ends up falling, Charles, the main character, ends up falling in love with his friend's sister, and there's a lot going on that's very weird. This book came out in the 40s. It explores the infatuation with wealth and almost an obsession with a family, so it examines a lot of themes like that. I did not like the movie, I did not like the plot, and I don't care how well it's written, I will never read this book. The last one is a relatively recent read from the 70s. I guess that's relatively recent. And that is a book that my mom has talked about quite a bit because it came out when she was in high school, and it was something that everyone was reading at the time. And it explores a bigger theme in a shift in romance novels. That is The Woof and the Dove by Catherine E. Woodowese. This book explores a forced romance. That's the best way to describe it, between a Saxon girl and a Norman conqueror. Basically, this guy, in 1066, it takes place when William the Conqueror was coming over to take over Britain. The Norman conqueror captures her and assaults her, and she ends up falling in love with him. Now, this book, while it sounds like just another, basic, stupid, erotic romance, that's true, but it also was the main book that a lot of people attribute to shifting the culture away from clean romances to more erotic romances that we see nowadays. And my mom talks about this shift because she saw it because she was in high school during this time, and she loved reading. She would read a lot of romances, and all of them were clean before this period in history. Whereas now you saw a mass market shift of romance books to being more graphic. And that's why, one, this book sounds horrible. I would never read it. It sounds horrible. I hate when, kidnap and assault is glorified as romance. It's the one reason I really struggle with a lot of Thailand dramas. If you've ever watched them, they are obsessed with having assault and then fall in love, and I don't understand it. I hate it. The point is, I will never understand why somebody would like this book. I know at the time in the 70s it was so popular. The lights just blinked. It's raining out. I'm sorry. I could rant about this book for a while because my mother has talked about it, and she never read it, obviously. And all the people around her did, so she heard the plot from them, and it just sounds absolutely horrible. And it's really sad to see that complete shift away from more clean romances to being more graphic, gratuitous. Those are all the classic books that I never planned to read. are there any on this list that you say, no, Anne, you definitely have to read this? This is an incredible book and you're missing the whole point of this book. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, like, subscribe. I post every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!